Tim Goldstein, autistic adult, and your host for Life in a Neurotypical Universe, where we take a look at life from the perspective of an autistic adult. Today on Life in the Neurotypical Universe, we have Dr. Lutza Ireland from Australia. Dr. Lutza, tell us about yourself.
Well, hello, everybody. I feel like I've been put on the spot a bit, even though we've been literally talking about an hour. We just actually started to record. So, I always get into this tizzy when I have to tell about myself because I had a very varied work history and I traveled around quite a bit. So I never know how much or how little to say. So I'm just going to free flow presenting. I've got a background in psychology, and I was working in mental health for quite a while. And what I have noticed is we are always running up against time and up against money because resources are so scarce in mental health. So I found that there were a number of things around education that are really repetitive. So we just have to keep talking about anxiety and depression in a way of what some of the signs are, what some of the feelings are, and how it's part of some of the adaptive responses of our bodies. But when we are kind of somewhat restricted by the amount of available Medicare rebates that people have for sessions, for example, we are always trying to give out extra materials for people to be able to read up more on whatever we are talking about. And so one of the things I started to notice is that a lot of people found some of the reading and some of the material useful, but sometimes I heard feedback that it made them feel even worse, or the way something looked, for example, a brochure, a leaflet, or a booklet was often really childish. So people were using a lot of clip arts to try to do illustrations. And especially with adult clients, it started to become a really big problem that it was getting harder and harder to find material that would really nicely supplement whatever we were talking about. And so one of my previous careers was in fashion and fashion design, and then a stint in hospitality as well. And I started to think about how badly mental health is branded, because from fashion and from working in bars, one of the things that we know is that if you want to sell something, you kind of sell it or make it attractive partially by making it aesthetically pleasing, by making it desirable, and by making people feel good about themselves. And there was quite a stark contrast to the way mental health resources were, especially at that time, we're talking about 10 or so years ago. They're usually presented in really quite academic, jargon-based ways that is pretty hard to relate to. And so I had this idea of basically making mental health hot to say that instead of treating it as something that is a disease and fix it and recover from it, why don't we just go for mental health in a way of, this is a good thing to have. Let's have it. Let's want it. And so I did a doctorate in design, which is in interactive and visual design, that was on how to develop mental health resources for education that actually engages people around mental health in a way that is both evidence-based, academically sound, as well as attractive to look at and user-friendly. Did I summarize myself up?
Well, you summarized a little bit of it. I know when we first met each other, which, now going back almost a couple of years now, at the time you were working as the head of neurodiversity for the Queensland School District. And I also remember that you had very recently at that point been diagnosed as being autistic. On the other hand, I also know that you are ADHD. So first off, we do know that you were adult diagnostic diagnosis for autism. How far back was the ADHD diagnosis?
That actually came first before the autism diagnosis in some ways, but it's a really, really interesting, and what I'm noticing is somewhat typical experience of adult females, but what happened to me. So it started when I was, let me think about it. It started when I got pregnant and I had hyperemesis, and that basically means that people are nauseous and vomiting like a lot. And it doesn't sound necessarily as bad as it is. So when we are just talking about nausea, I used to think that nausea is what you may experience after a really bad hangover or some kind of gastric illness, but it was really unbearable. So I was on a lot of medication. And one day I ran out of medication, went to my GP, again, really, really sick, heavily pregnant, and he was like, oh, so what are you here for? I'm like, just some nausea medication. He's like, yeah, cool. I'll give you a script for that. But I just also wanted to tell you a couple of things that I think other people probably wouldn't tell you, which is that your future child likely has the chance to be autistic and ADHD like you. And I was like, dude, I'm 38. I'm a psychologist. All my friends are psychologists. Nobody has ever mentioned autism and ADHD for me. Especially, I got qualified in the UK. And in the UK, to become a psychologist, you also need about 200 hours of your own therapy. So I was like, I've had so much therapy of every sort. It's never come up. Why would you think I'm autistic and ADHD? But also, like, don't even answer me. Just give me a handful of stuff to make me feel better, and I'm out of here. And I wasn't even offended. I was a bit like, just why? Just leave me be. I've got enough problems already. I just want to kind of get through this pregnancy. But he was kind of talking about that it's very likely that the child that I'm going to have will be difficult to soothe and have colic and some of these things that was just really kind of difficult to hear as somebody who's pregnant and waited many, many years to become pregnant, because I was very set on once I have a child, everything is going to be amazing. And I didn't want anyone to tell me otherwise. And so it just basically went to the back of my mind. My child was born. She had colic. She was very difficult to soothe. And after not having slept for many, many months, I was really at the brink of basically just that survival of it's really difficult to get through the day and feel like I'm still of sound mind. So sleeping became a really big issue. And with that, the sensory sensitivities, which I previously didn't know about, really skyrocketed as well. And so I went back to see this GP and I said that I'd really like to do a sensory assessment because I'm finding it very difficult to listen to the crying noises. And so I got a referral to see an occupational therapist, went to see the occupational therapist, and I said that I'm finding it really difficult to hear the child crying noises and like to do an assessment. And she was saying that it's very, very normal for mothers to find that it's very dysregulating to listen to children crying. And I was like, I'm sure that everybody does. But to me, it's not the emotion dysregulation. It's literally the noise that is just difficult. And it was like, yeah, but children crying are difficult. I'm like, yes, I know that it's difficult for everyone, but it's difficult for me to the point where when I'm in the balcony, I literally have to back away from the balcony because I just want to jump off to get away from the noise. And there was one of those things that, looking back, was a very frequent problem, that because I've got quite a flat presentation and my voice, unlike yours, doesn't go up and down and speak in a rhythm, and my facial expressions can be quite flat as well, which are, as we know, very often common autistic traits. When I calmly summarize things that are problematic, because I don't have the usual distressed expressions that other people might have, people often think that the problem is a lot smaller than what it actually is. And so when I was talking about this to the occupational therapist, she did an assessment, and I had a diagnosis of sensory processing disorder, which basically you really can't do much about, but there were some techniques on how to, use earplugs and whatnot. And it took me quite a while to go back to my GP and say to him, okay, so you mentioned something about autism and ADHD. Now I'm ready to hear a bit more. And I was really, really lucky, because he is an amazing person who has an approach with evolutionary psychology. So he was talking about neurodiversity, perhaps not with these exact terms, but he was talking about the different neurological ways of being wired, enabling certain things that are very adaptive. It might be problem solving or focusing attention in different ways. And that gave me more of a buy-in to think that, that actually applies to me quite a bit, a lot more than what I thought it would apply when I only knew the DSM diagnosis for autism and ADHD. So I started to familiarize myself with ADHD quite a bit more. But honestly, with autism, it took me quite a while to get around that one. And the main reason I diagnosed ADHD through a psychiatrist was because that has more of a medication support element. So I thought, okay, I'd like to try what that one is like. And so I got my ADHD diagnosis first, and it was probably a good 6 months until I started to think about autism. Because honestly, this is very reflective of the stereotypes that we have, even as mental health professionals, which is not only unfortunate, but it can be absolutely harmful with not recognizing the extent of what autism can be like and can present like. Because I thought that everything that I knew from autism and about autism was just not really relatable. Like people saying things about repetitive behaviors and stuff like that. I was like, I don't have any of that. And then of course, when you put it in more of an everyday context, I realized that some of the things that I wouldn't have called stimming, for example, just always picking my nails and playing with my cuticles, these are the stuff that repetitive behaviors can be like. Or when people were talking about special interest, I was like, but I'm not into trains, or I don't have a Marvel book collections. But to be fair, I'm a researcher, so I'm researching stuff like a demon. And it was also a very interesting realization that for females, things can be so different with presentation. So if someone is collecting trains, automatically people tend to think about autism a lot more than if somebody is collecting recipes, because if you collect recipes, then you're just going to be a good wife and make a husband very happy one day. So I just really had to realize that some of these social constructs around what the autistic criteria is and how it was framed as such basically young autistic boy with the stereotypical interest, that's actually very, very restrictive. And so that took me quite a while to to really think about my internal ableism, which is a very fancy word, just describing the fact that I had to realize that I actually had a bias in thinking that I don't want to be associated with how autism was often framed and described. And by now, I kind of forgot your question. I think you were talking about me having been manager of neurodiversity, which I was, and having been diagnosed with autism and ADHD, which I was as well.
You said a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. One thing you mentioned that I just have to comment on because it's one of my favorite topics. You mentioned how I have more melody in my voice than you have more of a monotone voice. And that was not my normal voice. I, as most of the listeners probably already know, I was diagnosed at 54 as being autistic. And prior to that, I had a very flat monotone voice as stereotypical for autistics. And totally unrelated to being diagnosed, I happened to be studying with a amazing, vocal coach that's probably one of the tops in the world. And I learned what he told me he was going to teach me to put emotional sounds into every word that I said. And I did it. And it was something that you can learn, actually. And what to me is really interesting is a lot of people will say that is masking. I'm trying to mask and fit in with everybody else, but I don't look at it that way. I know you haven't shared with our audience yet, but I know a few secrets here. And I know you originally were born and grew up in Hungary. So obviously English was not your native tongue by any means. And now you live in Australia where English is the normal language for the majority of the people. But do you consider speaking English now as being masking, or do you just consider it a tool that you need to communicate because that's what you need to communicate with the people around you? And I can fill in the blank for you. Obviously, you learned the tool because that's a tool that you need to communicate. It's not masking of hiding anything, of trying to hide your Hungarian background. It's merely, this is the language that they speak. And what I found out, and again, it was totally unrelated to the autism that I did the training in the vocal. But what I found out was the majority of people in the world speak emotional. That is the language they use. It doesn't matter whether the language is French emotional or whether the language is Spanish emotional or Hungarian emotional. But there's emotion in the language, and the emotion actually overrides the words. And I just look at it much like you now speaking English because that's the language of the people you're around, and it enables you to communicate in a far better manner than if you tried talking Hungarian to them. I've just learned that, speaking emotionally and having emotional sounds in my voice makes the communication easier for the other people to hear. Now, the funny part is I'm autistic and I do have challenges picking up those tonal qualities and the facial expressions and such of others. So it doesn't help me a single bit from the standpoint of me understanding what they're saying. But where it does help is they now feel a humanness, a warmth, a connection, so that when I speak, there is much more, I guess, uptake, you would say, of what it is I have said. As you mentioned, when you say it and it comes a lot more in that flat, monotone voice, it almost gets discounted. It's almost as if it's subtracting away from what the words are saying, because emotionally they're picking up that emotional tone is, if I was saying that way myself, that would mean I'm just not really into it. It isn't that important. I'm disconnected. And they're just applying that to it, not thinking that, no, this is the way you speak no matter what it is. And the words are carrying the information. So kind of a rampage on that just because it's a huge thing for me. So that I don't know where that fits in, but in somewhere.
I think it fits in perfectly. And I really agree that for me, even speaking emotionally or speaking English, it's not masking, but I definitely think that it needs to be understood as a way of translating. And on that note, what I would say is whether it's masking or translating, the difference is that masking happens basically because the fear of retribution. It's saying that unless I behave in a certain way, something bad is going to happen. And often it does. So very often I really have to say, especially when autistic people or neurodistinct people are part of other minority groups as well, there is often a lot more judgment and often there is a lot more even physical danger. So they mask because they have to, and it's not always a free choice to not to mask. And so what I like with this translation angle, that it says that I am speaking this more common language, or trying to speak this more common language of emotional tone of voice, because that brings in a commonality for understanding. But I also have to say that whether it's masking or translating, it still can be a lot of energy. So I have found myself that often I speak emotionally on purpose. And with being ADHD, I can get quite excited about things, and then I become a lot more animated when it's a topic of interest. But when I get tired, and especially when my sensory sensitivities are quite overwhelming and I'm just trying to keep things together, I may not have the same amount of energy to put into appearing emotional in terms of facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice. And I think that's when it would be really important to understand that with translation, if something is not your native language, it still may take you longer and more effort to translate into a language. And similarly, when you hear that somebody is not a native, for example, English speaker, if you are, you have a lot more patience for them making grammatical errors, pronounce words differently, not know certain things. And I would really like that to be a part of this two-way translation, that I can try to be more emotional. At the same time, the other person also needs to understand that it's not my natural way of expressing myself. So as much as I'm making an effort to appear more emotional, they need to make an effort to understand that even if I appear less emotional, that is my natural way. And by the way, I actually now find it very effortful to translate from English to Hungarian, because I left over 20 years ago. So I would really struggle with translation.
I think that's really very much what happens with learning to do emotional speaking, which is the terminology I use for it. You're right. At first, you have to concentrate on it. You have to think about it. You catch yourself falling off from it, and then you have to catch yourself and go back. But as you do it more and more, just like as you just said, after 20 years, your original language now is actually the foreign language to you. And your foreign language is now your native language. They flip-flopped. And it's the same thing of learning how to speak emotionally. Is the more you do it, at some point, this transition happens where it becomes the normal way that you speak. And for me to now speak monotone is actually hard work because it's now not natural for me anymore, but it's taken 6 or 7 years of doing it. And I work in jobs where I do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of training and those kind of things. So it far more than other people. If I just sat at a computer screen and typed on the screen all day, I probably wouldn't have picked it up as quick as the fact that a good half of my day is communicating. So I agree with you. At first, it's definitely effort, but as you go along, now the funny part, I think, is you mentioned how people should, meet us halfway, essentially. I know those weren't your words, but I think that's really what you were getting at. I like to say first off that, and usually it's the other way around. In this case, we're kind of flip-flopping it. Usually it's the autistic person, they want to meet them halfway. And that certainly would be fair. I mean, if we could meet them halfway, that would be fair. But the reality is, if it's a 4-lane road, they want us to take 2 lanes and they want to have 2 lanes. And unfortunately, if we don't have the capacity to handle 2 lanes, we might only be able to take 1 lane and they got to take 75% because of lack of capacity. And I think that is really the problem of asking people who speak emotionally, which is the primary world. There's plenty of studies from science studies that have been done all kinds of crazy ways that really show that we respond to sounds with emotions before we even process them as being sounds that our brain recognizes. And I think that puts them in the kind of the same point. They can't be 50-50 because it's hardwired in them to be listening for these emotional tones. What I found that I think is just funny as heck is, in order to get them to even understand that flat affect, monotone, not looking at them, in other words, seeming disengaged, can be the normal, you've got to say that, though, in an emotional way to get through to them that it actually means something to them. Because if you just say it in a flat affect, it doesn't land. So it's just kind of funny.
I really agree. And often, because one of the things that I think probably always takes a backseat for me in terms of talking about it, because the main interest tends to be autism and ADHD, but I'm actually dyspraxic as well. And that's not something that is perhaps as well known or much talked about as some of the other neurotypes. But in terms of what impacts my life and my everyday and day-to-day existence the most, I think it would probably be dyspraxia for me, because in my case, that also means that my coordination is heavily impacted in a way that I have to consciously think about things. So if someone says, I'm going to get up from this chair and make a cup of tea, they don't have to think about, okay, I'm going to have to push back the chair, then push myself up, move to the left, turn around halfway. Like I have to consciously process everything. Not very well, by the way. So I'm still going to bump into a number of different furniture, burn my hand slightly with the hot water, drop the cup. Maybe not all at the same one tea making procedure, but during a day, it would all happen. And so because that is so exhausting for me already, and if I have to do certain things that may be noisy and I have to discriminate numerous noises on top of each other. So that might be, if you're in an open plan office, there might be a chatter, there might be traffic, there might be phone ringing, and then someone talks to you. That's like 4 noises already that you have to discriminate in order to listen to that one person talking to you. So when you combine these things, my days, unless I do things that I'm really absorbed in, essentially spent on energy accounting. And energy accounting is it worth the energy that would make a cup of tea to actually have that cup of tea? And when you have to think about literally every single thing like this, it gets so exhausting that part of socializing or social interactions become part of this energy accounting. That is it worth my effort to speak emotionally and put my facial expressions in pro-social order so that exhaustion will come out of, for example, I don't know, not making that cup of tea that would wake me up. And that's when I kind of worked on this approach of what would give the biggest bang for my buck. And so usually instead of emotional speaking for every interaction, I choose the high stake interactions to be more emotional. and hopefully be let off the hook with the less emotional ones. So if I have to apologize to someone because I made a mistake, I know that that's always high stakes. So I put emotions in it. And again, this is not a fake apology, but for me saying, sorry, that's my fault, that is the same as when I say, I'm really sorry, I didn't realize that I did that. How did it make you feel? Like, that's what people think is more of an apology, or is more sincere or more caring. Whereas for me, saying sorry, it was hurtful, it was my fault, that to me is equally caring. So basically, I think often when I talk about the fact that I may not always sound emotional, or I may sound bored or disengaged or look away, I always put a lot of emotion into that. And I say people that I appreciate their understanding with that in a way that is quite emotional. And I'm hoping that that will carry me through till the next top up when I have to put some emotional top up into it.
I think I'm fortunate. And I heard a term that I was talking to a young gal, a 16-year-old, who is Asperger style autism. And she used the terminology, I hadn't heard it before. I don't think it's new from her, but I just hadn't heard it myself, of social battery, of your social battery getting run down. And I just liked that analogy of social battery versus other ways we've talked about it. And for me, it's maybe a little different. The way it works for me is I am what I like to refer to as being an outgoing introvert. Because I think outgoing and being shy and introvert and extrovert are completely different things. To me, the shy or outgoing is more how do you show up, and the introvert or extrovert is how do you recharge and get yourself back on your feet again. And being the outgoing person, or as my wife would say, being like your mother, I love chatting and talking with people. And it gives me it charges my social battery, or I guess I should say, it feels as if it's charging my social battery that I can do it. So if I'm going to a conference or something like that, which is quite taxing to spend all day meeting new people and introducing yourself and all that kind of stuff. But I enjoy doing it. It seems really fun. And it's not until afterwards, when I guess the adrenaline dies off, that I recognize that my emotional battery has been flat for probably half the day. So it is kind of an interesting thing. It seems to you notice it more as it's happening. For me, I get wrapped up in the situation that I'm just having so much fun in the situation, I don't even recognize that. I guess it would be similar to people who are into different athletics. They go out for a run, and they're just so into doing their run that they don't realize that when they get home, they're dead for the rest of the day because they burned themselves out. But while they were doing it, there was so much enjoyment in it that they didn't recognize the drain that it was actually causing. So. Yeah, it just obviously what it points out is just being autistic doesn't mean we're identical by any means.
Definitely. And I think perhaps one way of thinking about it is that with autism and ADHD, one of the concepts I really like is the interest-based nervous system, because when you go to a conference, for example, I take it's a conference that really interests you. So same with me. If I go to a conference, if I'm at university or if I'm at work, I'm really interested in how can we do things better, and hearing new informations and new perspectives. That's really effortless. And I can get really overtired and over-socialized without realizing it in the moment. What I find a lot more taxing in terms of social interactions is the non-task focused and non-interest focused social interactions. And you mentioned my work at the government Department of Education, and I have learned so much. I had a wonderful team there, and government organizations, just like every kind of sector, they have their own culture. And one of the things that happens, for example, in consulting environments is everything is very quick and task focused. So unknowingly, a lot of organizations are a lot more, I guess, ADHD and autism friendly than they think they are, because they are already set up to this. Let's work on this. Let's focus on the task. Let's kind of move on to the next thing. But often with government organizations and not-for-profit organizations, relationship building and the pace of thing is quite important. And so I remember even when I was working at not-for-profits, I would be sitting in meetings, and 20 minutes into the meetings, we only talked about how everybody's family is. And I was like, okay, can we get started? Like, can we just talk about the thing that needs to be talked about? I didn't say it exactly like this, but I knew that I had the tendency to come across as quite abrupt and uncaring, which is not to say that I don't care about how people are and how their life is. But to me, that's a conversation about them and how they are, because then the task is to catch up on how we are, as opposed to a meeting about XYZ when I want to talk about XYZ. And so what was really useful for me is when I was talking to one of my colleagues and I said, so basically, am I just supposed to sit in these meetings, sit through these very lengthy socializing politeness interactions, because purely breathing the same air in the same physical space will then create some magical sense of cohesion that will benefit me in a way of now you're part of us? And she was like, yeah, that's essentially what happens. And then ultimately people will be a lot more likely to prioritize when you're asking them something than when a stranger asks them something, because they already know you because you sat in that space. And I was like, well, okay, I didn't know that. And from then on, it really helped me to sit through things where I didn't see the point of it, by understanding that that's not a point for me, that's a point for the other person. And that's one other way of translating is that's patience from my part to go through the social interactions of small talk and whatnot.
It's interesting to hear that governmental agencies are virtually the same no matter where we go in the world. I did for a long time, I did consulting work, and instead of going and doing my own marketing of myself for the consulting, I just went through recruiters and took on temporary positions. I was in IT, so it's very easy to pick up great high-paying IT positions for 6 months, 8 months, whatever time it is. And the first one I ever did was actually for a county government. And it's also the only one that I ever called the recruiter and said, get me out of here. This is so brain dead. I'm going nuts, because they just don't do anything here.
Now, I will say about my team there at the Department of Education, I was very unpleasantly surprised how incredibly productive the whole diversity and inclusion and organizational transformation team was, because part of me taking that job was thinking, well, okay, government, like how hard are people going to work? Like I can probably work 2 hours a day and just take it easy for the rest of it. People were working so hard. It was one of the most productive teams I have ever worked with a director who had such common sense. Like for me, somebody having a common sense is pretty much the highest compliment you can imagine. But I would say that program that we have created is actually light years ahead of some of the most celebrated corporate neurodiversity pilots that exist at the moment. So yeah, I think it's very dependent on teams as well.
What I've seen is that they're very caring people. They really are concerned about what they do, but the pace of the environment tends to be, just as you say, a little slower, a little less direct and focused than in the corporate world. It's not that they,
Lots of red tape,
on the
yes.
other hand, when you look at frequently what they're paid, you can understand why maybe they don't put out quite the same effort. You definitely do make more remuneration in the corporate world. Obviously, though, there's higher expectations of productivity that goes along with that higher paycheck. You had mentioned way back when we started about recognizing from, both your design experience and your work in the hospitality world about the need to, and I'm going to use the term, you didn't use it, but of marketing, of actually marketing things. And in my mind, marketing comes down to, I had worked for this one gentleman who was very, very successful with building a chain of stores. And he was telling me about after he sold his chain of stores for way too much money, he was interviewing for a job as a retail consultant for a very, very high-end consulting firm. And marketing, I think, is a challenge for people who are autistic, because marketing is all about emotions. And most of us autistic people tend to be pretty logical and practical about things. And I always remember the way he put it was the interview, they handed him a pen and they said, "Sell this to me." And as autistic individuals, we would probably start talking about the material it's made out of and the durability and how many meters worth of ink there is in there to write line however long, and all these wonderful, technical aspects about the pen. And what he said, though, and it got him the interview, it got him the job. I say the guy was very, very, very good in the marketing realm. What he said was, "You want this pen because it feels good in your hand." And I think that's the part that we miss when we're talking about marketing, the whole concept of whether it's mental health, whether it's autism, whether it's neurodiversity as a whole, that most of the world does respond to emotions. If they didn't, we wouldn't be paying the billions of dollars into marketing and advertising that we do pay. Obviously, this is American football, not international football, but the Super Bowl. I don't know what a spot costs. It's like $50 million for 30 seconds or something. It's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But companies wouldn't pay that much if that emotional message that they're delivering, because they're not giving the tech specs by any means in those 30 seconds. They wouldn't be paying that money. Drug companies wouldn't be paying the fortune they pay to come up with these silly names for drugs if the sound of the word didn't mean something. Mm-hmm. Point I'm kind of coming back to is I know, again, knowing a few of your secrets, that while you were at the school, you had developed a mental health education program. And I very much remember having the discussion about Mary bringing in brownies and getting accolades. And it got nominated for a national award and went on and won the award. I mean, it's nothing to be embarrassed about that you happen to have won more awards in more fields than most of us alive. But really what it was showing was your awareness of marketing. So just talk some more around the thoughts about marketing, the whole thing. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about marketing mental health, but more so, the big terminology now, of course, is neurodiversity. And what is neurodiversity? And some people who have been involved a long time want to make neurodiversity mean not the same thing that diversity means, which seems a little ridiculous because you're just putting the word neuro in front of the word diversity. And diversity already has a definition, which is all humans. So I don't think we can change the fact that diversity means all humans just because we butt neuro against it. But we certainly recognize that there's interest. Some people are approaching it as being oh, let's just go hire autistic people. Other people are approaching it as, there's a range of ways that our brains process and perceive and think. And that is neurodiversity. And that involves all humans. If the brain functions, you're in the bucket. So just give me your thoughts. What do you think about the whole neurodiversity and marketing neurodiversity?
Oh, lots of thoughts. I will go back to the award for a moment, because the reason why it is quite important is because the way I design my resources are based on a framework that was the outcome of my PhD research. And the research essentially involved multiple stakeholders from the community to discuss mental health, because what I noticed is we have the professionals using accurate and evidence-based terms, but those terms are often alienating. And evidence-based, for example, around how biology works, doesn't necessarily resonate with lived experience. At the same time, people who have a lot of lived experience, in marketing terms, they may make things more hot, more relatable, so the uptake of it is more engaging. But we can't cut out evidence-based completely based on how one person feels. And at the same time, often loved ones and carers and the environment that we are in tends to get quite neglected when we talk about whether it's neurodiversity, mental health, or what have you. So basically, what I did is I created this framework with people who have lived experience, people who are loved ones and carers, and mental health professionals, including evidence-based health knowledge. And the framework is about how to talk about mental health from multiple perspectives, how to talk about invisible health from multiple perspectives, so that we don't just have a basic understanding on what it is, but we have the ability to communicate about it, and we have the ability to critically think about what we are saying and how we are feeling. And so the award was to me very important purely because of the fact that it represented work from many, many dozens of people who have very freely given their time and expertise to the cause. So I feel like the award is like everybody's award, whoever participated in co-design based research, because it actually went somewhere and went somewhere tangible with this resource. And so the response to neurodiversity is that, similarly to what I initially noticed in mental health, we have academia and thinking around what neurodiversity can represent, who's included, who's excluded, what does neuro mean, what does cognitive mean, what does diversity mean. So there can be a number of academic arguments for how to position this. And then we have the lived experience. And we have a lot of, I guess, homegrown advocates who base a lot of information that they have on their own experiences or their own and their friends and loved ones' experiences. And that, of course, doesn't give the full spectrum of experiencing either. So when we think about neurodiversity, to me, the question really is, who are we looking at serving? What is it that we are trying to accomplish in here? And originally, the term was meant for a civil rights movement. But I think, to me, diversity just basically means differences. And so if we think about neurological differences, that literally means everyone. Everybody has differences because no two people are the same. And in agreement with you, I think when we talk about diversity, we need to think about, do we want to achieve inclusion? Do we want to achieve a sense of belonging to everyone? To say, whatever difference you have, you belong because you have a role in your community, in your society. You can be loved, you can be accepted and embraced for who you are. So come along. To me, that's the essence of neurodiversity. But it's not to say that everybody has the same needs and everybody has the same strengths and challenges. And I think this is where we often get unstuck. And you often hear me talk about the diversity Hunger Games, which I think is one of the essence of what's happening in here, that when we have this scarcity mindset, by the way, for good reasons, because what we have seen in, for example, in my career spent in health and human services, we are always understaffed, underfunded, and scrambling for resources. So, of course, people have this scarcity mindset that we're going to run out of funding, and we do, and we're going to run out of resources, and we often do as well. And so instead of saying diversity is there so we can take advantage of different perspectives and evolve in innovative ways, we say diversity is basically the minorities who deserve funding because they have it bad enough to warrant some money getting chucked at the problem. And that is a really, really bad approach to diversity, because what it essentially means is that it's pitting people against each other, because minorities essentially have to prove how much worse they are off compared to other people, because that has been traditionally the way of getting funding to get support, is positioning yourself compared to people who have it better and say, I'm struggling a lot more. Yeah, and that is a very strongly deficit-based approach. So I think when we say neurodiversity is only for what we often call neurominorities, we are really risking creating a very strong division where people need to categorize themselves into different minorities in order to get noticed. And yes, this has been an established way. So I'm not saying that anybody's doing anything wrong. And of course, on the other side, people can find a lot of sense of belonging and community and acceptance through belonging to a certain group. I'm just really wary about the goal being that we need to be able to take funding from the big pot, and that's when we get pitted against with the diversity Hunger Games of, if you look at often DEI programs at companies, or for example in Australia we have the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It often goes into point systems of how much impairment can you prove that would warrant a certain amount of money or support coming your way. Or in company terms, we've already done the gays or the women or whatever the flavor of the month is. What is this neurodiversity thing that we need money chucked at? Like, what do they do? How do they have it badly off? That's generally not a very helpful way of thinking about diversity.
It comes to me as you're saying that, and I never thought of this term before, but neurodiversity to me, it would be, we have to look at diversity, which is the root of it. And in diversity, there are certainly some segments that are getting more money put towards it than others, but there's the recognition that amongst all humans, there are some groups that have more and there are some groups that have less. And they're all part of diversity. Even if you're on the have more group, maybe you're the problem in diversity, but you're still part of diversity. So when we put neuro in front of it, we can't say suddenly it becomes less than everybody. Now, what the term that just came to my mind is neurosegmentation seems to be what everybody's, or not everybody, but some people are promoting neurosegmentation where, oh, it's only these people that belong under this neuro category and everybody else, I don't know what you are, but you won't belong to us. As opposed to diversity, which is simply saying there's all different people that vary by gender, by orientation, by culture, by ways. And all of us together make diversity, and we want to obviously utilize those variety of perspectives to build strength. Whereas what I see happening in the, I'm going to call it neurosegmentation now. I like this one. In neurosegmentation, it's this fight to say we're more important because we're so-and-so. I think, as you say, the diversity Hunger Games, we're now turning it into the, oh, because I think differently, which gets down to being kind of funny. We just roll it back into the medical field. We know that if we study autism, just pick that one for instance, I'm sure we could pick many other conditions and it's very similar. There's been 3 major people that were involved with creating the current definition of autism. And obviously one was discounted, which was Bettelheim and the refrigerator mama approach. But then we had Connors, who was the nonverbal child. And then we had Hans Asperger, who was the young, brilliant professor type, phenome, I guess we'd say. But what we really come down to, I guess I'm getting to, is that this isn't like having COVID, where we go run a PCR test and you have it or you don't have it. This is something that a bunch of humans, yes, they're knowledgeable, they're learned people, but we've also seen that we had knowledge and learned people that thought the earth was flat, and then we had knowledge and learned old people that thought the earth wasn't flat, and then we had Newton, obviously brilliant person, and we now have quantum mechanics, which shows that Newton wasn't perfectly right. This one, though, we can't test. You can't really test. I mean, all these definitions of being autistic, being ADHD, are very much interpretations and human decisions around making groups. So it becomes really funny when you look at it from that standpoint of these are fake categories to start with. And when I say fake categories, I simply mean that in 10 years from now, the categories are going to be different. They're going to shift again. This isn't established science at this point. This is very much evolving stuff. And we're having these crazy fights and arguments without looking at the way that the rest of the world interacts and interrelates with it over fake categories. And it's really kind of funny when you think about it. I think one of them is, I know you and I tend to use the terminology of neurodistinct. Instead of, there was another term that has no particular standing other than somebody pulled it out of wherever they pulled it out of neurodivergent. But I think what the difference is you and I both recognize that you have to speak in the way that the market wants to hear things. And just like the gentleman I worked for who got the job by saying, it's how the pen feels. Well, we know words have sounds. The sounds of words carry meaning to most people. There's the Kiki and Booba effect studies. And for anybody that hasn't read those, just go put in Kiki, K-I-K-I, and Booba, B-O-U-B-A, and it will pop right up. It's like your favorite search engine, whichever one it is, just use Google. And what it really comes down to is in this, what I find so interesting is they've actually tested autistics. Again, this category of where's the edge end that you are autistic or you're not autistic. I like the term of, I use functionally autistic. The medical world won't say you are, but you suffer just as much as the rest of us. So walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. I'll consider you to be a duck then. But the Kiki and Booba effect was these researchers made up these 2 words. And they are fake words. They sound like words, but they really have no meaning whatsoever. And they took 2 shapes. There was one that was a star, kind of like the comic book POW kind of star. And there was a rounded blobby kind of a shape. It's kind of like funny looking potato or something. And when they exposed that to the general populace, something like, I can't remember the exact figures, what is it, 88% or something like that of the general populace will take Kiki as the star and Booba as the rounded one. But when we go to the autistic population, the last version of the study I read, and it's been done multiple times, 55% of autistics actually discriminate between those two words meaning either of those two shapes. So we have a group of people that basically don't recognize that words convey meaning by just their sound alone, deciding to use a word that sounds negative to everybody else. Which to me, coming from a marketing background, and I've owned my own business, I've worked in lots of retail-oriented businesses, so I've done a fair amount of marketing, just like you have. We've got to consider the audience that we're speaking to. And the audience that we're speaking to is the 88% that recognizes the difference between the two words. So what's your thought? I mean, in the framework of putting it into marketing, because it's great if we can sit in our own corner and talk about it however we want, but that doesn't do anything for improving the acceptance of people who think differently, whether it's autistic or ADHD, or if they fill in any of the blank of any different way of thinking. If we can't get the general populace to accept that ranges of thinking are normal.
For me, in terms of the terminology neurodivergent versus neurodistinct, describing neurotypes that have, now I just got a third term, which I really, really like, but in terms of marketing and all the rest of it, it's an interesting one, because what I'm thinking about is always, how do we increase community awareness and acceptance and understanding of a certain concept? And for me, to do that, a term needs to be user-friendly enough so that everybody can use it and understand it, which is what you would call marketing. But it would also have to have enough of a kind of scientific or evidence-based sounding background so that it sounds serious enough to take it seriously. And so what I'm trying to say is that there is a term that's neurospicy, which I really, really like, because that to me really depicts that it's not to say that what we call neurotypical, which is the so-called normal way of thinking, is either better or worse, but that is that kind of normal that, I don't know, like in Australia, steak and 3 veg might be normal, but it's very different from a curry, or it's very different from certain foods that people also really love. It's just spicier. And so it's not to say that a curry is better or worse than steak and 3 veg. It's just saying one of them is spicy and the other one is not that spicy. And so the point I'm trying to make is that the reason why neurodivergent to me doesn't closely align with being able to increase mental health literacy around it is because it is so long that for starters, that it really decreases the readability. So when we think about the general population, the general population's reading ability worldwide is around grade 5 to 6. So generally anything that's more than 3 to 4 syllables is going to be fairly problematic to read. If you then look at a community's diversity in terms of linguistic diversity, immigration is so vast that every country or most countries would have such a large proportion of immigrants or language diversity that any foreign sounding language, such as neurodivergent, that is as long as this, and it's very difficult to depict what it means because divergent is not a common term that you would hear in every day. That's going to be fairly off-putting and alienating for the majority of the population. And I think sometimes terms like neurodivergent, they can be such a double-edged sword because on one hand, it's special in a way that makes it sound alienating, like divergent has that sci-fi alien sounding element to that. And for some people that might be attractive because it's interesting, it's futuristic, and that can be very cool. But for most people, it just basically sounds like a disease. So neurodivergent sounds like a neurological condition that you probably don't want to catch. And at the same time, the fact that it's quite jargon sounding in itself can be really attractive for a lot of people who have been dismissed throughout their lives because a lot of difficulties, for example, sensory sensitivities that the majority of people don't have and is an actual day-to-day difficulty for most neurodistinct people, have resulted in us being continuously told, why is it always you with a problem? Everybody's having a good time. Why can't you have a good time? Why are you overthinking things? Like, what's your problem? It's nearly like, it's not a diagnostic criteria, just to make that clear. But if you've been told, you're too sensitive, you're overthinking this, why can't you do this when everybody can do this? Think about whether you're neurodistinct, because these are generally the things that we have heard growing up a lot. And so for people who have been dismissed all their lives, as in, why are you creating the problem if there is none? Having something that is very serious sounding, like neurodivergent, can be really, really validating in saying, I told you that there was something wrong and you didn't believe me. You sometimes talk about the example of a common cold being called, I don't even know what it is, but it's something acute respiratory, whatever it is. And you wouldn't say that to your friend, that I'm just at home having an acute respiratory, whatever it is, because you would say, I have a bit of a cold. Because that's every day, that's normalizing that pretty okay, it just things happening. At the same time, you would be more likely to call work and say, I'm having acute respiratory, whatever it is, because that's so serious sounding that it gives you that legitimacy of something is going on. And so what I'm trying to say in here in many different ways is that I think neurodivergent is a very complicated term that I don't think is a user-friendly term. Neither is one that depicts neurodiversity in a way that I would find it most inclusive for the most amount of people. Whereas neurodistinct is basically saying that there is a typical way of, for example, thinking, feeling, experiencing the world. Again, typical is not to say that's good. Typical is saying that that is the most common, plus minus 10%. So often when we consider different margins in a statistical way, that is plus minus 10% within the average. And for me, saying that somebody is neurodistinct means that they have distinct ways of functioning and operating in many domains. For example, problem solving, communication, attention, and so on. And so that, to me, makes it a very common sense part of we are different, and some of us have strengths and challenges within the typical range, and some of us have strengths and challenges in more of a distinct way.
Yeah, I personally have no issue if somebody wants to refer to themselves as being neurodivergent, just as if I have no issues if somebody, gives me their pronouns, whatever they are. I'm happy to respect them. I think everybody deserves the dignity of being referred to and addressed in the manner that they want to be referred to and addressed to. On the other hand, I have many of the same challenges you have with the neurodivergent. I maybe even have some more. I have this concept, I call it the emotional life of words. And an idea of the emotional life of words would be if I say the word beach. Most people, when you say beach, kind of happy. They start beaming a little bit. They're thinking of warm water, nice blue water, palm trees, white sand, nice beach, a vacation, maybe a pina colada in their hand or whatever their favorite is. But when we go and look up the definition of beach, the definition of beach has nothing emotional attached to it. It's pretty bland. It's an interface of water and land, and that's about it. And in the emotional life of words, again, it goes back to that Kiki and Booba kind of effect of words do carry emotional life to them. And I think part of neurodivergent, it's a PhD level word. It's got too many syllables and it's too hard to spell and it's not self-descriptive. And what I've seen from doing job counseling for a number of individuals that would be very, very high IQ level, Asperger style, and they have a tendency to use their PhD words on everybody. And I can understand why. Being autistic myself, I've gone through life being told, why can't you be, why can't you be, why can't you? So you finally accomplish something and you're maybe overly proud of it and you overuse it. But what happens is the people who are receiving that PhD level words, first thing that goes through their mind is, I'm feeling really stupid, because they can't decipher the words. It's not making any sense yet. And of course, nobody wants to feel stupid. So the next thing they go to is, you're the jerk that's making me feel stupid. So if you want to be the jerk making everybody feel stupid, then use a word that they can't understand. So that's, kind of one of my hangups with it is, by using it, it actually puts you in a less favorable light than if you were to use a word that was more approachable by the person that didn't make them feel stupid. And then the other thing I would mention, and of course you just contrast it to, basically neurotypicals, the quote norm. I think it goes back to marketing. And this dawned on me. I was preparing for a presentation, and what this particular company wanted a presentation on was where neurodiversity fit into diversity, which is very different than what's been going on in many of the presentations of the past, which is, what superpowers can you bring in by hiring these people in the company? I think this is a much better discussion of where does neurodiversity fit into diversity. It made me sit down and actually go look at the U.S. National Institute of Health and look at the prevalence rate for the 5 most common conditions that people would put into the neurodistinct category. And when I added them up, it comes to 52% of the population. Now, of course, we know that there is overlap, like yourself, ADHD and autism together. But we also know that there's way more than 5 conditions that go into the list. So even if we said they only balanced out, and I think they more than balance out, actually, that means more than the majority is not neurotypical. So what finally dawned on me is, why were neurotypicals able to set the norms? And the answer is they're the most cohesive group, so they marketed themselves better because they're so cohesive. So in other words, everywhere you turn, you get their version pushed at you because they are cohesive in the overall plot. Identical? No. I mean, obviously they're not identical, but very much similarities in responding to the emotional cues and communication styles and all of those kind of things. And I think it's that cohesion that essentially, without even realizing it, they are really marketing their norm to everybody. And because we're so broken apart. The ADHDers don't work together with the autists, which don't work together with the dyslexic, which don't work together with that. We can't say that, no, norm is much wider because we're being overpowered by 35 or 38% of the population because they actually are cohesive.
And I don't know how much of it is cohesiveness and what the percentages might be. I think one of the things that stand out to me is how life has changed since the Industrial Revolution, because part of what's happening is essentially in the capitalist systems, in order to maximize profit, you need the cheapest production. And for that, everything being uniform and mass produced is pretty much a must. So that means that to personalize something, to allow people to have their own distinct desires, qualities, to really shape what suits them the most, that doesn't suit capitalism, because you would have to then modify and personalize and provide options and provide multiple things, as opposed to just doing the one thing as cheap as possible. And so I think what people often forget is that modern life actually doesn't suit anyone. It doesn't suit neurotypicals particularly well either. They just don't struggle as much with it than neurodistinct people. And some of the reasons for that, I think, is just purely less sensitivities, for instance, with some of the increased noise and the increased changes in the environment that I think is often perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back. So I noticed that even though I have not just an auditory processing disorder, but also misophonia, which means that certain noises just really send me into this fight or flight response. But when I'm in a forest, I don't have any problems with sounds because it's a much slower, much quieter environment. But as soon as I come back in the city, it's multi-layered noises on top of each other. So again, it's not to say that city living doesn't suit anyone. It is to say that the stress of living in the city, it might be fairly minor for some people to the point where they even not notice it. But for others with sensitivities, purely living in a city in a noisy environment can already push the tolerance for other things lower. And so the reason why it's important to understand is because, especially in the last decade or so, since we moved into this omni-connected world where information is just absolutely inundating everything, people who have some difficulties with executive functioning. So that's generally the brain's project manager of planning, organizing, prioritizing, and so on. If you imagine like hunter-gatherer era, your weekly to-do list, it could have been kill the mammoth with 10 other people. That's it. You've got that one thing on your to-do list. Now, if you look at the average person's to-do list for a week, I have often, and this is not exaggeration, about 70 things on my to-do list. And it's not because I write everything down, but once you have a child, even just to remember what's Pirate Day, when do we need to give the money for the teachers, when do we need to book in for holiday care, now it's whatever day, that can be like 10 a week. That is an extra thing. And then on top of it comes which electricity provider do you choose? And then all the things that used to be a non-thing. Similarly, when I want to catch up with friends, we need to organize and manage calendars that used to be partially a job of an executive assistant or secretary, but now it's something that we all have to do. And so I think these excessive demands that are essentially part of modern life, making everybody's lives difficult. But I think neurodistinct people find it a lot more taxing to cope with because our coping resources are often already eaten away by just generally trying to withstand processing the amount of information that comes across our way, which we tend to feel and experience a lot more heightened. And I just want to say one more thing, referring back to the diversity Hunger Games. I really want to emphasize that there are people whose needs do require a lot more resources. And so I want to make it clear that I really want to honor that, but I want to honor that in a way that is something that happens because we want everyone to live their best lives. So I wish that the basis of providing for people's needs and well-being would be what makes you to be the best human being that you can be, rather than how many points can you show from your suffering that legitimates X amount of dollars to be thrown your way.
I agree with you. The Industrial Revolution, I think, was a pivotal point, and I look at it maybe a little differently, and that is we came up with the idea of interchangeable parts was the big piece of the Industrial Revolution, but the other big piece that we don't talk about as much was interchangeable workers, and the whole concept that one worker is just as good as another worker, just plug them in, and they needed to be interchangeable. And if we look at people who do perceive, process, think differently, they are not necessarily interchangeable. And if you roll it back, as you said, before Industrial Revolution, what would happen if you had your kid thought, acted, whatever, a certain way? Well, you would find something for them to do because everything was done within the village or close by. There was small amounts of trade. So there was a lot of variety of what the person could go into as a profession to support themselves. Now, though, as we were under the Industrial Revolution, suddenly we started moving things to specialization, except for the workers and the parts. Those needed to be interchangeable on both sides. So we suddenly lost that ability to find the environment for a career field. I guess you'd say career field. I don't think they thought of it as career fields back then, but you lost that ability, though, to find that, your child was very good at outdoor kinds of things and wasn't really an in-the-house, inside kind of person. So you sent them off to work with the local farmer, where they're out working outdoors. And again, as you say, the whole just level of how many things on your task list. When there's very little communication, except for when the people in the village get together, there's not a lot on the task list either. It wasn't interchanging all these pieces. It was the blacksmith made things from one end to the other. They didn't have to worry about 12 different companies involved in the process of building the one item. So I definitely would agree that Industrial Revolution was a turning point for humans in both good ways and in bad ways. Well, if somebody was interested in getting a hold of you, finding out some more and help them straighten their own company out and understand neurodiversity, what's the best way to reach you?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn would be the best.
So how do they find you on LinkedIn?
Dr. Lutza Ireland.
Perfect. Well, I will actually go and get your LinkedIn URL and put it down into the show notes so that people can be even real easy and they don't even have to be able to figure out how to spell doctor because we don't want to use PhD words on them. Well, this has been wonderful. I've so much enjoyed having this chat with you and taking this time. And hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
You're more than welcome. Thank you. We hope that you've enjoyed another episode of Life in a Neurotypical Universe. Please, if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends. Go take their phone and subscribe them. It will help us all out. If you want to know more about neurodiversity or have any questions for me, you can reach me at my website, timgoldstein.com, where I'll be more than glad to help you as best I can to navigate through the neurotypical universe.